welcome. My name is Gwen Wilcox. I'm a partner at Levy Ratner in New York City, a union and employee firm. And I'm also a member of the College of Labor and Employment Lawyers. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the panelists today, as well as the college. We hope to engage you in discussions regarding COVID-19 vaccinations in the workplace. We really want to just kind of roll up our sleeves and think about and talk about and identify issues that impact us all with regard to COVID vaccinations. And we really want to particularly thank you, those of you who are eligible for the vaccine, that you've taken your time away from your search for trying to get the vaccine and be able to spend time with us. Because really the underpinning of our discussions today is the fact that there is a shortage of vaccines. And so, you know, the discussion today really will center on the issues in recognizing that shortage. Before I introduce our stellar panel, I'd like to just give you some information that will be helpful to you with regard to this program. Materials for this program can be found in the handout tab on your control panel. These will include a document containing live resource links, as well as the CLE fillable webinar form. I also want to thank Safe Offshore for sponsoring our CLE credits today. Now, if you're interested in CLE credits, you will need to download the form, complete and return it to SafeForth using the email address provided in the chat function. It is cle@safeforth.com. And you can also email Susan Wan. I will be providing a CLE code that needs to be included on this form towards the end of the program. The code will also be shared in the chat box at the same time as I announce it. So moving to the panelists, I'd like to introduce you first to Commissioner Sonderling. He was nominated by President Trump on July 17, 2019 to the U.S. Equal Opportunity Commission, and he was confirmed on September 22nd, 2020 for a term that expires July 1, 2024. He had been designated by President Trump to serve as Vice Chair of the Commission, and his term as Vice Chair ended on January 20th, 2021. Next, I'd like to introduce Carla Grossenbacher, who is a partner in labor and employment at Safe Offshore. She's the chair of their Washington, D.C.'s Office of Labor and Employment, their office's Labor and Employment Practice. She's head of the firm's Workplace Privacy Team and co-chair of the firm's Workplace Biometric Privacy Compliance and Litigation Group. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Bill Saylor. Bill is the Senior Vice President and Legal Counsel for Qualcomm Incorporated, where he has handled a wide variety of legal matters for the company, including employment law, corporate governance litigation, privacy, anti-corruption issues, and ethics and compliance matters. He has been selected and is also a fellow of the College of Labor and Employment Law. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce you to Gail Blanchard Sager. She's Vice President and Counsel, Labor and Employment at California Hospital Association. And she provides leadership for state legislative and regulatory issues related to hospital, human resources, and labor relations. So at this time, I'd like to ask Commissioner Sonderling to start us off and give us a short overview of EEOC's guidance with respect to COVID vaccination. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. Since the pandemic began, the EEOC has prioritized providing guidance to address the intersection of COVID-19 and federal anti-discrimination laws. The development of a COVID vaccine has given rise to a new set of legal considerations for employers who wish to mandate vaccination programs. On December 16, 2020, the EEOC updated its COVID-19 guidance to address how the administration or requirement of the vaccine intersect with the ADA and Title VII. Before addressing potential exemption issues, I want to emphasize two important guiding principles of last month's guidance. First, the EEOC definitively stated that the vaccination against COVID-19 is not a medical examination as defined by the ADA. Second, the EEOC opined that asking or requiring an employee to show proof of receipt of a vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry under the ADA. However, employers who will administer the vaccines themselves or contract with a third party may run afoul of making an ADA-prohibited disability-related inquiry, because administering the vaccine requires certain pre-screening questions that may implicate a disability-related inquiry. Employers must be mindful that any pre-screening questions related to the vaccine are job-related and consistent with business necessity. Asking an employee pre-vaccination screening questions may also implicate and violate the Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act, as such questions regarding family medical history or information about an employee's or their family members' immune systems are prohibited. To avoid liability that would arise from making a prohibited disability-related inquiry or an inquiry into genetic and family medical history, our guidance advises employers that this restriction will not apply if a vaccine is offered on a voluntary basis. An employer can also avoid liability by simply requiring the vaccination be administered by a third-party medical provider, such as a pharmacy or hospital that the employer does not have a contract with to perform the vaccinations. In this case, restrictions on disability and genetic-related inquiries would not apply to the pre-vaccination screening questions because they are not solicited by the employer or a contractor acting on the employer's behalf. As discussed earlier, the EEOC has definitively stated that asking or requiring an employee to show proof of a receipt of a COVID vaccine does not violate the ADA or GINA. A note of caution as to any subsequent questions, though, the most obvious one being, why didn't you get vaccinated? Such questions are then likely to elicit information about a disability or protected genetic information and would be prohibited disability or genetic inquiry. If an employee refuses to comply with a mandatory vaccination policy because of a claimed disability, the employer can exclude that employee from the workplace. Prior to excluding an employee from the workplace, the EEOC guidance recommends that employers conduct an individualized assessment in determining whether a direct threat exists. The conclusion that there is a direct threat would include a determination that an unvaccinated individual will expose others to the virus at the worksite. However, a direct threat determination does not automatically allow the employer to take actions against the employee. The EEOC stated that the ADA requires the employer to attempt to provide reasonable accommodations that would eliminate or reduce the risk level at which the employee does not have a direct threat. Examples include providing masks, plexiglass, change of work duties, or separate working spaces. If an employer cannot accommodate the employee because it would be unduly burdensome to reduce the threat to an acceptable level, the employer can exclude the employee from physically entering the worksite. Still, the employer cannot automatically terminate the worker. Before terminating the employee because no accommodation can be given, employers must be mindful of other obligations that they may have to the employee outside of the EEOC's jurisdiction, such as the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the FMLA, or the employer's own company policies. The next area of concern for employers mandating vaccines is Title VII, which prohibits employment practices that discriminate on the basis of religion. The law protects employees who indicate that they have a religious objection to being vaccinated. When an employer is on notice that an employee's sincerely held religious belief prevents him from receiving the vaccine, the employer must provide a reasonable accommodation unless it would pose an undue hardship. Ultimately, if an employee cannot get vaccinated because of a sincerely held religious belief and there are no reasonable accommodations available, the employer is permitted to exclude the employee from the workplace. Again, this does not create an automatic right to terminate the employee. Other factors and laws must be considered. Finally, Both Title VII and the ADA may trigger accommodations for employees who cannot be vaccinated because of pregnancy. A pregnant employee who is unable to receive the COVID vaccine due to a medical condition related to her pregnancy may also be entitled to reasonable accommodations. Although pregnancy itself is not a disability that implicates the ADA, certain pregnancy-related medical conditions may in fact trigger additional ADA accommodations and protections. The COVID vaccination and other guidance discussed here can be found on our website at eeoc.gov/coronavirus. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to hearing how this guidance is practically being implemented by my co-panelists.
Thank you, Commissioner. So we're going to come back to you in a moment on some of the issues that you've raised, but we wanted to start off and ask a question about, surveys. What's the how do we value surveys that may be given to employees to determine whether they have been vaccinated already, whether they intend to be vaccinated, and whether they want to work in a fully vaccinated work setting? And we're going to start our discussion right now with about circumstances under which the employer is planning to mandate such vaccines. So, Bill, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. One observation I have about everything related to the coronavirus is that my initial instincts are generally wrong. And it was that way with testing, and it was that way with a lot of steps that we took in the workplace. And surveys, we've been talking about doing one here, and there are several issues with them. And the biggest that don't really relate to Title VII or anything, there are privacy restrictions around the world about what you can do and what you can ask and the like. Generally in the US, I think you can perform a survey, although how you ask the question is obviously going to be important. One of the questions I would pose, though, is what's the value of doing a survey? What do you do once you get that information? And we come from my company, bunch of engineers, we're very data driven. And so we always want to gather data before we make decisions in what we're doing. But then it's not clear to me what we're going to do with that data once we complete the survey. And so we sent it out yesterday, and I filled out the survey and gave my thoughts. But I think it will be interesting to see what value we place on that, other than just kind of getting a general sense of where our employee base stands on the idea of requiring vaccines in order to allow employees to come on site. And I think that goes to one of the major considerations on whether or not to require employees to be vaccinated if they're going to work on site, which is kind of the employee relations side of things. It's possible to require it, as Commissioner Sonderling noted, but then the question is, do you want to do it? And my informal benchmarks so far are that not a lot of employers are going to be requiring it. We're still studying it. Right now, we're still in the phase of there are way more people who want to get vaccinated around San Diego than there are people getting vaccinated. So it's not as much of a problem right now. But trying to understand what the benefits and the problems are with doing it as an employer, we think our employees look to us to provide a safe workplace. And I think that in general, the workplace, if you listen to the medical folks at least, is safer with people being vaccinated than it is with people not being vaccinated. And so that's kind of where my analysis starts. But there are, as the commissioner noted, and I think a lot of people have noted, there are kind of personal concerns and objections to the virus. Of course, you make reasonable accommodations for disabilities and religion, but are there just people who have strongly held beliefs that don't amount to a religious belief, but just that they don't want to be vaccinated for whatever reason. And I think that's going to be, a big factor in our evaluation as to whether we're going to require it. There is talk of liability for require, what if something goes wrong with the vaccine? And Gail can talk about, liability protections for providing the vaccine, but from my perspective, much of that would be covered by the workers' compensation laws. And I also think as we look at whether to provide the vaccine, require it or not, I wonder if the harm to our employees is greater if we don't require the vaccine than if we do require it, and there may be a small number of people that are affected adversely by the virus. So those are a lot of the things that we're thinking about right now in terms of looking at whether or not to require people coming on site to be vaccinated. I, for example, since the pandemic has started, I've worked entirely from my home, haven't really been on site other than to pick things up or the like. So I would not, if I don't come on site, then there would be no need to be vaccinated, people like me. But it's the people that are coming on site every day for what is part of an essential manufacturing operation for us that we want to make the workplace as safe as possible for them, while also kind of understanding and appreciating their individual circumstances.
Thank you, Bill. So, Gail, would you like to address, some of the comments that that Bill mentioned, and really and move into the issues of workers' compensation, which is a big issue, and when we think about mandation.
Yeah, thank you. So, as everybody recognizes, at the moment there is not enough. So California hospitals, like all other employers, are not in a position to mandate it. But the question of adverse reactions to the vaccine has come up already, because there have been some situations where an employee may need to take off a couple of days due to a reaction. I think a handful of serious reactions, but even more minor reactions. And so every state has its own workers' comp law. So, I'm in California. I can only speak to California, but I think that the principles are probably similar. California has a no-fault system. We have a 3-day waiting period. So someone who has a small reaction might not want, they might not even decide to file for workers' comp. But the issue about whether the claim is accepted or not, at least in California, turns on whether the vaccination was mandated or voluntary. And so right now, as I said, no one's mandating it because there isn't enough. But there is a spectrum of voluntary at one end, kind of moving along to strongly encouraged before you get to mandated. And so what I have found in speaking with our California hospitals is the workers' comp administrators are really taking the position that kind of this strong recommendation is closer to mandating and would cover, and adverse reactions would be covered by workers' compensation. So again, it's kind of, at least in California, on the spectrum of whether the vaccine is strongly encouraged. There are other opportunities possibly for someone to get paid if they need to take time off due to adverse reactions. Again, in California, we had up until the end of last year, COVID supplemental paid sick leave, which was also offered obviously under federal law. Those have both expired. It is possible that something's going to come back, and whether that covers adverse reactions, that might replace, the need for someone to file under workers' comp. So I think although we're not at the point of being able to mandate, there are clearly situations where an adverse reaction could be covered by workers' comp, and it does seem to turn on whether it was strongly encouraged.
Okay. Carla, would you like to add anything to this? Otherwise, we can move on to another area within this topic.
Well, I'll just add two things. On the issue of surveys, our clients typically are looking at doing surveys on an anonymous basis for two reasons. One, if you find out if people in your workforce are inclined to get the vaccine, then maybe you don't need to worry so much about mandating it if you find out that 90% of your workforce says they're lining up to get the vaccine. Also, our clients who are looking at doing on-site clinics want to know if it's worthwhile to do them, if enough people want to get vaccinated that it makes sense to bring someone on-site for voluntary flu vaccines. And the only other piece that I want to mention something about related to what Gail said about sort of strongly encouraging, we do talk to our clients about, you know, providing information to employees, encouraging them to get vaccinated, but drawing the line really at a strong encouragement and providing any information about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. Because if you make those statements and any of those statements as an employer turn out to be false, and I think there's still a lot to be learned about the vaccine and its safety and its efficacy, that could come back on you in a liability scenario. So those are the two things I would add.
Okay. Yeah, and I would just say that from my perspective as a union and employee lawyer, that I think that surveys can be helpful in terms of the union engaging its membership in terms of their willingness to take the vaccine and understanding what some of their concerns are, as well as the staff. And I work a lot in the healthcare field, and you know, it varies a bit from depending on what part of the population, whether it's hospital workers, nursing homes, or home care workers. And so that really helps the union in terms of figuring out what to do. I will say that mandation was not something that was on the table in terms of discussion, but just to better understand how many people would be interested in taking the vaccine and so forth. And so moving along, we heard from Commissioner Sonderling about the exceptions to taking exceptions under the mandatory, if there was mandatory vaccines. So I'd like to hear and see whether Gail or Carla have any comments with regard to, you know, in circumstances as to whether an employee can or cannot accommodate an employee based upon the protection under their protection under the EEOC. So why don't we start with Gail?
Sure. I think as I mentioned, we particularly here in California, while our healthcare workers, and we represent hospitals, so our folks were really, you know, first in line because of the shortage. We really haven't had to go there yet. And kind of on the issue of surveys, kind of what I saw hospitals doing was, once we knew that the vaccines were going to be available, remember that was a moving target, they sent out information about how the vaccine clinics were going to go in the hospital. So we are the provider and employer in many instances, and in some respects, that notification of we've got the vaccine, start signing up, are you going to accept or decline, was kind of the survey, you know, all in one. And so what they found was demand more than supply. So frankly, we haven't had to deal with that situation yet. Folks who are not comfortable getting the vaccine just haven't signed up yet. I think we're going to get there. And I think it's challenging, you know, for healthcare, just not even hospitals, but in healthcare, we've got the dual issue always of employee safety and patient safety. And so it is this tension. So if you've got an employee who, you know, works in the emergency department and declines the vaccine, you know, what is appropriate? Again, we also have PPE that is available. So we haven't actually gotten there yet, but it's going to be pretty complicated, honestly, for hospitals to kind of parse that out. What is an undue burden? What is safety? And that type of thing. So yeah, we're not there yet, but it's going to be pretty complicated. So I really strongly recommend those in healthcare, again, whether in hospitals or outside, to start thinking through that, looking at the EEOC guidance, obviously, putting it in the perspective of employee safety and patient care, and also considering any state laws. Obviously, in California, we've got our very active Department of Fair Employment and Housing, and so I'm sure they're going to weigh in as well. So start thinking about it now before it actually happens.
So Carla, just it doesn't matter whether you want to speak about, you can speak about any of the exceptions, but from your experience, what do you think are considerations that employers have to think about with regard to those accommodations?
Well, I think, the issue is largely theoretical right now, except for healthcare clients that are mandating. And most of our clients, if you look at the whole stable of clients, the vast majority are not in healthcare. And the things that those clients are looking at are, standing up an accommodation process similar to what they currently have. But what we know from looking at the cases from mandated flu vaccines is all of the lawsuits are around not making exceptions, right? Those lawsuits aren't about, well, my employer probably shouldn't have mandated it. It's you didn't make an exception for me. And our clients are aware of that. And I think the large majority of them are reticent to deny an accommodation. And reality is, if someone makes a plausible argument that they have a disability or a sincerely held religious belief or some kind of other legally based objection to taking it, that there's not going to be a lot of appetite for trying to deny that. So I think, people are conscious of the fact that that's where the litigation is going to come from.
Okay. Well, thank you. So I'd like to, we have a question that came in on our next area in terms of wellness programs, as well as incentives to encourage staff employees to be vaccinated. So, Commissioner, is there anything else you'd like to add to what you already stated, mentioned in your introductory comments?
Specifically to wellness, this is the question now that has been coming up is regarding employers who want to incentivize employees to get the vaccine, and whether that's with paid time off or whether it's just bonuses or otherwise. We're seeing a lot of examples of that. The EEOC has not yet opined on this issue. It is certainly on our radar with the amount of publicity it's getting and the various companies using different programs. But from our perspective, is to be mindful of the wellness rules, and the whether or not those programs become voluntary or not is up for debate. And right now we have our proposed wellness rule that you could read on our website. And because it is open rulemaking right now, I cannot comment further other than encourage you all to read what we're proposing, which is going to be a de minimis standard for healthcare, for incentives for employers to participate in wellness programs, and how that intersects with COVID vaccine and wellness is something certainly we need to hear from all of you on. So I encourage you on our website to read the wellness proposal and then submit comments about potentially how companies are using incentives and wellness programs to get their employees to be vaccinated.
Okay, thank you. And Carla, with regard to the use of the direct threat defense, can you just give us some thoughts on how that would be used under these circumstances, or how it would apply?
Sure. So, the direct threat comes into the EEOC guidance analysis in, as Commissioner Sonderling pointed out, in potentially denying an accommodation if someone poses a direct threat and you can't minimize that threat to reasonable accommodation. It also goes into whether you can administer the vaccine on your own, if you can make the case that it's job-related and consistent with business necessity, which requires you showing that unvaccinated individuals would pose a direct threat. It seems a very high standard on an individualized level. It's got to be something more than they're not vaccinated, right? Because if I'm not vaccinated and I'm not sick, I don't pose a threat to anybody. So there's something more that has to be required. And I think in the average employer setting, it's going to be a very hard case to make, is what I would say. And again, as I mentioned, most of our clients don't have an appetite to get into fights over accommodation requests if they are plausible.
But in our
Okay.
initial guidance that the EEOC put out in March, we did declare that having COVID is a direct threat. So in the previous H1N1 guidance, that determination wasn't as clear as that. So there's no question you can exclude an employee from the workplace who currently has corona or potentially has it from getting back from travel without having to deal with that analysis of whether or not it's a direct threat. You know, as Carla says, the next level here is when employees who do not want to be vaccinated want to come back to work. And then, you know, it really goes down to your business. Obviously, hospital settings are going to be different than a law firm setting. So really that individual analysis needs to be done. And then the next level is saying, well, what kind of accommodation can you give them? And obviously there's different standards, legal standards under the ADA, which is a much higher burden than under Title VII with religious accommodations and as well as pregnancy. So it's really that next step once an unvaccinated employee wants to come back to work and you make that determination, well, can the direct threat be minimized? Assuming there is a direct threat relating to an unvaccinated person, how do we minimize that threat? Is it through masks, gloves, plexiglass, telework? That analysis needs to be made. And if you make that determination that you can't accommodate them, or it meets that undue burden threshold of costing too much or more than de minimis in religion, then it goes into the exclusion from the workplace where you say, well, you can. And then it gets a lot more complicated about whether or not they can perform any work, or you modify their job duties from them working outside of the workplace, eventually getting into the termination, which I said earlier leaves the EEOC context when you start talking about other protections they may have under state or local law or even company policies.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to move along because time is moving very quickly here. And I know there are some questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them at the end of this session. So the next question is really centered on circumstances where the employer's choosing not to mandate someone. And the questions about, liability. What are the liabilities of spreading to employees who seek to be mandated or who become infected? What are the rights of employees who engage in concerted activity who are seeking to mandate where employers not mandating? What are some of the discrimination claims being brought by disabled employees who seek protection? And then also, what's the process and with regard to how OSHA can be helpful in terms of addressing any of these issues? So I'm going to, Bill, do you want to weigh in on any of these issues or not? Because you're
Sure.
working in a setting where there's no mandation or you're leading in that direction.
Yeah, well, it's the other side of the coin in terms of what I was talking about before. So, it's interesting, just one side note, and I don't know if it makes a difference or not, but I don't think about the word mandate as I do. I frame it as, do we require in order to come on site? Because I think it takes perhaps some of the value-laden determinations made out of it. At my company, less than 25% of the employees are coming on site, and most are working from home like me. And so then the question is, for those that are coming on site and feel themselves to be at higher risk by coming in and convening with others, are we going to require the vaccine for that? And so it's the other side of the mandate question, which is, if you don't require it to come on site, then are you doing what you need to do to keep the workplace safe? Very much like our employees kind of assume that we're looking at these kinds of questions every single day and all types of safety issues. They want to know that that's something that we're trying to do. And for us, there's different kinds of jobs, some of which it may be difficult to segregate out, for example, and provide a separate office or those types of things, because it's lab work that kind of necessarily has to be done, in labs and in the same room, or those types of things. And so there is the concern that people will make a claim, probably, as Gail noted, on at least in California, under workers' comp. In fact, there's a presumption that it would be under workers' comp, I think. But then, you know, what about both legal and I think it also in terms of employee relations liability, even if it's not legal liability, for people who live with those who may be susceptible or extra susceptible to the virus, or just live with people who may become infected as a result of them being in the workplace and contracting the virus when the company didn't do everything it could to minimize the risk to the people coming on site. And I think that's the challenge. I think another consideration that's kind of interesting, and this is kind of a behavioral economics question, is if you require a virus, does it make it less safe because people will let down their guard on social distancing practices, wearing masks, staying 6 feet away, washing hands, all the types of things that we've kind of gotten used to doing over the past many months. And I think if you listen to what the medical folks are saying is, even after you get the virus, you still have to abide by those kinds of restrictions. And I think, you know, one of the battles that we're facing with respect to the coronavirus is it's kind of a battle of attrition, and you know, we can lose our will to follow those safety guidance, and if people get vaccinated, will it make it less likely that they will follow that guidance in the workplace, and therefore make it perhaps less safe for others in the workplace? So I think, again, as you weigh it, it's not as clear cut one way or another as you would probably think that it would be, which is why I think, from my understanding, most employers are electing to strongly encourage people to get vaccinated without requiring it.
Yeah, and I think what you were saying, like, you know, really by having those who are being vaccinated, that we still will have to adhere to social distancing protocols, as well as wearing masks and, I should say, plexiglass. And so that's probably depressing for some people, but the reality is that, you know, employers do have responsibility, and, you know, and workers want to be safe as well, too. Moving, Gail, would you like to add anything else to that?
No, and I think, you know, again, my frame of reference is California, and so is Bill's, but listening to him, and California has adopted a temporary standard for all workplaces related to COVID safety in the workplace. And so one of the interesting components of that is it doesn't really address vaccination. So how do kind of normal workplace safety require, or not normal, and what is now expected as far as workplace safety requirements, how does that interplay with vaccine? If it doesn't reduce your obligation to do all of these other things, right, on balance, you know, does a mandate make sense? And I think you could still show, if you were doing all of these other things, the social distancing, the masking requirements, you know, all of that in the workplace, that, you know, you'd be in a pretty good spot. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how kind of this OSHA, these OSHA obligations as they move forward, how that's going to interplay with vaccinations. It just hasn't happened yet.
Right. And Carla, you look like you have something to add to this discussion.
Well, I think, you know, we're going to have to see what happens with the state and local restrictions that are really the driver for masking, social distancing, infection control in the workplace. You can vaccinate as many people as you want, but until the legislature in those states decides to roll that back. And, you know, Virginia was the first, I'm in the Washington office of SIFARTH. Virginia was the first state in the country to have that temporary emergency standard, and they just made it permanent. So, you know, right there that it's not going away anytime too soon. And the standard in the Virginia law is a double mask. It has to be 2 layers of cloth. So it's sort of not getting easier. It's trending the other way.
Right. Okay, so I think we're going to move along. I know that we spent a lot of time on mandation, but I think that we have some other area and not mandating, but we'd like to move into the area about what's the impact on employees who refuse to be vaccinated, and and that can come about obviously in situations where the employer has mandated them, or even when it's voluntary, the mandation is not being required. So there could be circumstances where employees are not being, may not want to refuse to be vaccinated under any circumstances. And so one of the things is that, COVID-19 has really shown the fact that it really has had a disparate impact upon people, Black people in particular, and Latinos, and so that has caught, those increased numbers of infections as well as deaths has really, carried over into now that our discussions about vaccinations, because many people do not want to be vaccinated because of lack of trust, feeling like in the past that they have been victimized as guinea pigs in studies. The vaccine has been too quickly developed, and so that really translates into people who are working, and depending on how the employers dealt with the issues of PPE and during the surges, or the continued surge, and how they communicated with their staff about issues. Now, when an employer is saying you must be vaccinated, or we are strongly encouraging vaccination, that doesn't mean that the employees are where they're at. And so they're not necessarily where the employers are on that. And so, that can give rise to, depending on who are the groups of people, how people are being treated, to discrimination claims, because there may be groups of employees who feel like they're being discriminated against more adversely than others, and that their voice is not being heard. If they are employees who are working, have to come to work every day, and don't have the option of working remotely, then they're being burdened with that responsibility of being vaccinated when they might not want to be. And employees who are remote can continue to be remote workers, and it's not necessarily a situation where the policy of mandation or taking vaccines is really an issue with respect to their employer. So, and again, employees, as to whether employers are going to, eventually be disciplining, that would not necessarily be the first step, but it could ultimately be that their employees could be in job jeopardy. So, I think in terms of talking about what we in terms of mandation or not mandating, it's really important for employees to understand the culture of their company, and understand, how receptive would the employees be to mandation or vaccines, and really to have those understandings before just putting out a policy that may or may not work. And it'll be hard to roll back from a policy that has been put out there without really a lot of input from everybody. And that's one of the things we've learned through COVID, that communication is really key to helping to make everyone remain safe and understanding of what, how they can be safe in their own circumstances and as well in the workplace. So, Gail, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just something quickly. Hospitals or healthcare, I'll talk for healthcare, very diverse environments. And so I completely agree with Gwen. And one hospital kind of came at this by going through their first round of vaccinations and then evaluating their workforce to identify, were there any trends that they could see of people who were declining? And this is voluntary, right? This is early on. There was no way to mandate vaccine. So looking at their workforce and looking at whether there are trends, and what they saw were their communities of color in their workforce had a lower acceptance rate. And so then coming up with strategies, not to mandate, not even strongly encourage, really to educate. So Gwen, I wanted to actually kick it back to you, that the example that you gave of that physician who, you know, worked with, I just thought was a great example, whether you're in healthcare or not. But so I wanted to kick it back to you to highlight that that example you provided earlier to this panelist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so you're referring to, it was actually in healthcare, it was a nursing home where where the employees as a group decided not to take the vaccine, and they were very adamant. Maybe there were a few that decided they would, but the other employees collectively decided they were not going to take it. And the employer, you know, didn't, you know, fortunately, what they did is it was a unionized setting. They brought the union in to talk with the workers to see how they could convince. But one of the things that came out of that discussion was the fact that because there was so much animosity and lack of trust during the surge, where, you know, nursing home patients were, you know, dying left and right, staff were coming in, they were being encouraged to come in, not to quarantine when they should be quarantined. You know, when the employer said you have to be vaccinated, even though they weren't necessarily saying mandated, but they were saying that they wanted their staff to be mandated, the workers just said no, they're not going to do it. And the union actually had a hard time rolling that back. They're, you know, the employers are trying to do, you know, talk with them, the union's trying to talk with them. But, you know, I think the misstep was that if you haven't done well in 2020 by your staff, it's going to be hard then to turn around and definitely undo some of that. And, you know, so communication is really important. And so I think that when we talk about before we put out a policy, it's really important to understand who you're, you know, what that impact is going to be, even if you're not mandating, but you're really strongly encouraging employees to do mandation. And I think that, you know, I mean, the union's hoping that, you know, in time they'll make some changes there, but right now this has been going on for quite some time, and you know, they haven't really been able to budge on that. So
I think what you also gave an example of a situation where I don't know if it's the union or together with the employer brought in some physician to speak.
Yes. Right. Sorry, I like that other story too. But I'm sorry. Yeah. So in terms of convincing both staff and members to help them, after they did a survey, they brought in healthcare professionals, really a public health doctor who had personal experience. Her dad had passed away during COVID. Sister is a long hauler. She had COVID, but she's still suffering under COVID, and she works in this field, and it was very convincing in terms of being able to have those conversations with members. And from a very personal experience, she's of the same race as a lot of the members and the staff. That was also very important. And she just knew how to she communicates well. And so I think that one of the things that one of the surveys I saw that, you know, you have to think about who is going to be who's going to be the face and the voice of the communication. Because just because it's a CEO of a company, that doesn't mean that person's going to be the key person. You have to really think about who your audience is and what's going to help convince them in terms of, it may be a CEO depending on a small company, depending on circumstances, but you have to really be helpful, you know. And we found in a survey that the union did that CEOs of hospitals were not going to be the best communicators of that information, and a persuader. And so the union, for example, ended up, you know, having the president of the union ended up making, you know, being vaccinated and showed, you know, when he's eligible to do so. And, you know, they're having videos about that. So it's important to find out what's out there, in terms of resources that you can communicate, help, supplement the message that you have with workers. So, and just like, and that whole point is, I think, in terms of communications, that both in companies and unions, that, making certain that your communications departments are really, part of that discussion too. So make sure that you don't have any missteps in terms of your communication, because that can be very helpful. Okay. So let's see where we're at.
I would just offer that education, as much as possible, is absolutely essential. And we've had a number of sessions with different physicians to come in and talk about not just the medical aspects of it, and I'm terrible at the medical aspects of it, so I keep on watching it and learn a little bit each time, but also the practical aspects of it and how it works and what an R, the spreading is, and the reason for having the vaccinations and achieving less spreading and the like. And I would encourage that. My daughter works for a technology company in the Bay Area. They've had doctors on all hands meeting as well. Those are some of our, in my company at least, the most well-attended meetings. And I think providing that information is really helpful, because there is some misinformation out there, and just trying to find, people that talk, down the middle of the plate as much as possible, I think is really helpful and allays a lot of the concerns and fears that people might otherwise have.
Right. Yeah, and I think all kinds of media, whether it's, by, virtual meetings, also, websites, just be as creative as possible so that information that you want out there is out there in a reliable way, as opposed to because we're all inundated with so much information. And so, having pathways for communications between, businesses and employees is important. And, and so, Carla, anything you want to add to this? Because otherwise you can move on to.
It just underscores the issue that this is not just a legal issue for our clients. A long time everyone was asking, can we mandate? Can we mandate? And now we know we can mandate, and now everyone's wondering if they should. They're all wondering what everyone else is doing, but they know that it really has to do with what's going to go over in their specific work culture with the people they have working for them.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's what we've learned in the last year, in terms of trying to figure out how to keep up to date as things change on a daily basis, and helping everyone to kind of get through this as insane way as possible. Right. Yeah. Okay, so I'd like to, so the last point, I think, before we can get to some questions, it's just like in terms of the role of the union, I think I've, mentioned this before, but, the question in unionized settings, what happens? So there is an obligation to bargain over these issues. If an employer was to mandate, that would be considered mandatory subject of bargaining. And so, that's the reality. They're under the National Labor Relations Act, employers do, if there's an emergency or exigent circumstances, they can make unilateral changes. I don't think we can say that the pandemic is an emergency anymore. We've been living under it for so long. And, the vaccine we talked about, is just, hopefully being the savior from last year. We were like, okay, we can't wait for the vaccine. So, there certainly were opportunities to talk about these as they were vaccines, as in anticipation of there being available medicines as they were vaccines as they were being developed. So employers, would have to sit down and bargain in the unionized setting. You have to look at, what your management rights clause is, of course, and also what the collective bargaining agreement is. But I say that, as we said, I think on this, webinar, that it's even if you thought legally you could do it, whether you should do it, right? Because, we said this is not all about legal issues, but it's about what is going to be effective in your workplace. And and even if, and there are circumstances where you might have the right to, employer might have the right to bargain, but they also will ultimately have to bargain over the effects of the decision. And so the effects of the decision could be actually pretty broad in terms of what those issues are, as to who would get it, who would have to be vaccinated, senior people first, people who are out in the field, people who don't have contact with the public, people who do have contact with the public, what would be if someone gets sick as a result of the test of the vaccine, whether how employees be compensated if they have to be out. Is there going to be additional sick leave or time off due to that? How does that impact, where there are state laws or local laws with regard to COVID, or are they applicable under these circumstances with someone's getting the vaccine? Probably not, but maybe, you just have to look at that. How does this impact, with workers' comp? So, all these issues, there are a lot of issues that would ultimately have to be decided whether an employer had to bargain over the actual decision to implement mandation, or just to bargain over the effects of the effects of their decision. And again, the issue as to whether what would happen if an employee refused to be vaccinated, what would happen there, and so making sure that there's a process under those circumstances. And I think in this area, in addition to bargaining, where you have a collective bargaining agreement, you have a grievance and arbitration process, what happens where employees refuse? So on one hand, the employees are refusing to be vaccinated, but there are other employees who would want everyone to be vaccinated. And so, in those conflicting circumstances, it poses, issues for the union, depending on what their decision, what their view is on terms of mandation. And so ultimately, those employees who are in counter to are opposing or challenging the employee's policy, and they ultimately get disciplined or, are forced to come to work, and under what circumstances, in terms of what protections they would have. There could be grievances, and so it would be important for the union to make certain that they have a representative who can effectively represent that person to protect their interests, even though they may be counter to what the policy may be. And it's and then what, I think other issues might arise is when a union might will seek to assist employees who seek a mandate when employer does not. So what's the union's role? I don't know what the answers would be in these situations, because fortunately they really haven't come up, but I can see down the road that once there's more supply, there could be issues about the conflicting positions of employees regarding that. So, I think that, as time goes on, and while there's more, when there's more supply and employers begin to make decisions, we'll see a variety of issues that are going to develop over time. So, Gail, do you have anything to add since we on this topic? So I know we haven't had a lot of bargaining.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that covers it. There are two questions. When we get to the questions, there are two questions in the chat box that I'm particularly on California law and the right to privacy so I don't know if you want me to take that now or wait.
Yeah, I think, that would be fine.
Take it now? Okay. So someone had noted, and there are two questions that are really interrelated, about the California Constitution's right to privacy extends to these types of things. And I would completely agree with that. And that relates to another question that was posed. Are we seeing any trend in state or local governments prohibiting employers from mandating the vaccine? So in response to that, I was going to point out that California really does have a very strong right to personal privacy. And so I think that that is a question that is kind of really front and center in California in particular. For California hospitals, we've been kind of analogizing this to the flu vaccine. In California, there is a law that requires hospitals to offer the flu vaccine every year, but employees may decline. And the employee's right to decline has never been very well defined, but I think most people think that they can decline for any reason. And so we're kind of watching to see what the state or local jurisdictions are going to say with respect to the COVID vaccine in light of how the vaccine has been handled, as well as the individual right to privacy. So I think they're really good questions and really good points. So we haven't hit that tension yet, but we are absolutely on the path to getting some kind of answer, and or either through the state, our legislature's back in session now, we might see a bill, or our Cal-OSHA or our Department of Public Health, any one of those could come out with some guidance. And then I am sure, because this is California, Bill knows there will be litigation around it. So whichever way it goes. So we'll have to see. But I would think that California, for better or worse, is probably going to be on the forefront of this because of our existing laws with respect to individual right to privacy.
I do think that the case that was cited, the Pettis versus Cole case, if I recall, that was requiring, sorry, they're doing work in my house, requiring alcohol, inpatient alcohol treatment. If I recall correctly, it was a while ago. I think there are distinctions, and the right to privacy under the California Constitution is not absolute. And I think one of the unique things about the vaccine, as compared to requiring someone to get rehab services for alcohol, for example, is that the vaccine is a kind of community solution that works better when more people do it. And I think that's what complicates the analysis. If it was only an individual choice, right, a Johnson controls type choice, then people can make decisions for themselves. But here, what it is what you do can have an impact on other people. There was a question about this before, and you're right, it doesn't directly have an impact on other people, but people getting the vaccine can reduce the R factor, whatever that is, the chance of spread of the vaccine, which is what we've been trying to do since this started. And so I think that actually changes the analysis from, at least with privacy issues, toward looking at more, looking at the balancing that goes on, and gives the employer a much stronger argument for it.
Okay. So just looking at some of the questions in the chat, there's a question as to whether an employer can mandate employees to be vaccinated as a condition of entering the workplace. And there's reference to the OSHA requirement that an employer provide a safe and healthy workplace. Anyone want to address that issue?
I'll just take the first part of it, not the OSHA part. We had talked about the EEOC in its March guidance had said essentially you can exclude an employee from the workplace because we're saying COVID-19 is a direct threat. Also, as a condition of employment, that is addressed in our guidance as well. If they're, again, going in that same analysis, is looking into the reasonable accommodations and how can you accommodate that employee to mitigate those concerns. So that analysis doesn't necessarily change for new employees, and that's addressed in our guidance and offers as well.
Yeah, and I was going to say that when I mentioned that there's an obligation to bargain by the employer regarding vaccines in most instances, that would not apply to applicants. So if an employer required new hires to be vaccinated, that would be they would not be deemed until they get employed, hired, they're not employees, so the employer would be able to mandate vaccinations for applicants because they're not employees under the National Labor Relations Act.
Yeah. I would just add, I agree with what Commissioner Sonderling said, that it's really sort of the flip side of the same coin. In the way you can't immediately move to terminate someone who doesn't get the vaccine, you can't immediately move to not hire someone who doesn't have the vaccine, right? It's the same process, and it's a little more difficult even in the hiring scenario, because if someone's not vaccinated, the EEOC guidance says you can't ask them why they didn't, right? So unless that applicant wants to come to you and say, I want an accommodation because I didn't get the vaccine because of, a disability or whatever, again, you're in that same analysis. So those are the same issues.
Right. Okay. So, I think we have time for probably 2 more questions. One is, there's 2 vaccines that have been approved pursuant to, emergency use authorization. FDA requires that the recipients be advised of their right to refuse. That is a right guaranteed by federal laws. Laws will vary from state to state, but many states allow for common law public policy lawsuits when the employee is given the Hobson's choice between a right, filing a workers' comp, and keeping their job. How can an employer mandate with the emergency use authorization?
Yeah, I'll take the first part of this. As far as the, in our guidance, we do talk about the emergency use authorization and link to the FDA and HHS's and CDC's information on this. And, it's a little tricky because when a vaccine is under the emergency use authorization by healthcare law, they do need people receiving the vaccine do get additional disclaimers and additional warnings and additional opt-out to not take the vaccine when you're sitting there about to get the needle in you, giving you these fact sheets from HHS. So, from the EEOC's perspective, that's outside of our world if an employee does not get a vaccination because of the EUA. However, they come back to you and they're saying, I refuse the vaccination, at some point you're still going to have to do an accommodation analysis, whether that claim is under the ADA or it's under Title VII. It gets a little tricky because now they're actually saying, well, I'm not getting the vaccine, not because of the ADA, not because of Title VII, because of the healthcare law. So, where that fits into our spectrum is certainly new and hasn't been squarely decided yet. But, I'm curious from a more practical standpoint, I would imagine that an employer faced with this situation would try to make a reasonable accommodation, whether they're using the ADA undue burden standard, the Title VII religion de minimis standard. It's really up in the air because the reason they're not taking the vaccine is not because of disability, not because of religion, but more of the EUA. And obviously none of this applies to, a typical flu shot or when this vaccine becomes permanent, that disclaimer is not going to be there. But certainly for now, it's I don't want to say a gap, but it's certainly a hole as far as what happens when an employee comes to you with a mandated vaccinated policy and says, I don't want to take it because of essentially this third option, which is not covered by us.
And I guess
Okay.
I was just going to kind of add to that. I think that factor actually is part of the analysis of do you even want to move to a mandate, which, so I don't know that you'd ever even get to the reasonable accommodation because, right, when you're thinking about do we want to mandate it, again, I think it goes back to what Bill was saying and probably Carla, a lot of this is also, your relationship with your employees. And so are you willing to mandate something that's under an EUA that has all of these other kind of peripheral issues around it? So in my mind, that's a factor in deciding whether you're going to mandate in the first place, the EUA status. So just my thoughts.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. We're not going to have enough time. Some of them do, touch on some of the issues that that we've answered already. So I guess here's one question: is in terms of mandation, what what about the fact that there's no scientific information that establishes that vaccines protect anyone other than the employee who is vaccinated? So how does that, impact decisions by employers?
I think that's the point, that it helps stop the spreading. The more people that are vaccinated that cannot get the disease, the spreading slows down, and that's been the push, the public policy push ever since the pandemic started, was to reduce the R factor, keep it from spreading, which is even more challenging now given the new strains that we're seeing come out. So I think that's the best argument for that in that regard.
Okay. So just before we still have a few more minutes, but I do want to give the code for today's program. It's SS7881. SS7881, and that you will need to add to your CLE form if you would like CLE credit. Okay, we're going to take one more question, and let's see here. So here's the question: is if you ask someone why did they get the vaccine, why they did not get the vaccine, isn't that a disability-related inquiry? And wouldn't that mean you can't ask that question unless the employee posed a direct threat? So I don't know, Commissioner, whether you can answer that question or not.
Well, you can. You're not saying you can't ask the question, but if you ask the question, then you're going to go down to start making that determination if it is a business necessity, and then you start getting into the direct. So it actually starts that ADA process from there. If you're going to push back and you're going to say, well, why didn't you? Then it needs to be, a necessity, a job necessity, and business necessity and job related. So, in certain industries, more again in hospital settings, you can, because it's going to be, the fact that it's going to be mandated relates to the underlying job. So not saying you can't, but in certain situations, you just be prepared. You're going to start that discussion and make sure it is, a business necessity, or you can run afoul by the ADA.
Okay. All right. There are two questions here that I think that it would be helpful for the audience to hear, and we're not going to be able to get to every one of them. But do employers have to tell a patient whether a healthcare provider has been vaccinated, if asked by a patient or potential patient? That's a question. It's a good question. Be pondering.
Well,
You're on mute. Gail.
Yeah, punting a Gail on that one.
Hello.
I think Gail might be muted.
Yeah, that's to say. Are you muted? You muted, Gail. Uh-oh. Okay, well, Carla, while she's...
Well, we do get this question from clients, and I would be interested in Commissioner Sonderling's thoughts. The EEOC guidance says you can ask whether someone's been vaccinated. You should tell them when giving you proof of vaccination not to give you medical information along with that proof, which suggests that the proof of vaccination itself is not medical information, which many people would think it is, but then not subject to ADA confidentiality restrictions. So then you're dealing with, would that be an invasion of privacy, right? Even if it's not ADA confidentiality. And I think there are many people who would consider the choice not to be vaccinated to be a personal choice, maybe a political choice, maybe a religious choice, whatever it is. I have to analyze it from, are you infringing on that person's privacy to explain that to someone? I think it's unclear.
Well, it again depends on whether that the employer's mandating or not, or just if it's a voluntary, then at that point they're providing you that information, and they'll tell you whether or not they received the vaccination. But it's certainly it's tricky, and employers need to be careful. Just when you're taking that next step, it needs to be job related and a business necessity, and just you need to be prepared to do that analysis. Once you cross that threshold, you're going down that road, and then you're going to have to make that reasonable accommodations if necessary, and just start that whole process I discussed in my introduction. So it is so, I don't want to say employer specific and industry specific as to what the unique circumstances are for that individual employee, but the employer is going to have to make that determination about their own work setting and their own business. So it's hard to answer in the abstract, but certainly just be prepared. And I think the EEOC, we've done a great job in laying out, if you're going to take the next step, we've given employers a lot of outs as far as making it voluntary, or just having that as far as the intake and that confidential medical information, essentially just going to a pharmacy or going to a state that they don't have a contract with. But if you're going to do it yourself, or you're going to start asking questions why, it just really needs to be going back to what the core of that business is. And when you talk about mandated vaccines, you talk about, again, in the hospital settings where they've been doing it for decades, for whether it's the flu or other diseases, where it is clearly they can meet the standard of it is a business necessity, and so that is really the area where you kind of see that next level. But other than that, it's really going to be industry specific.
Right. Yeah. And lastly, it was just a question on whether, employer can terminate an employee who refuses to come to work until they are vaccinated. And so I remember that question coming up some time ago, where when employers were looking to reopen, and, employees were, beginning to say that they did not want to come back until they were vaccinated. And so I guess I guess it would have to be, I think it would have to be fact specific, and as well as the fact, as the vaccine becomes more available, hopefully that will become less of an issue.
Yeah, that's going to be very fact specific. It's also assuming that, there's a lot of vaccine available, but, outside of one of the categories we discussed before for exemptions, whether it's the ADA, whether it's Title VII under religion or pregnancy, it gets out of the EEOC world. And then, as I said earlier, there's just other considerations, whether it's the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, Family Medical Leave Act, leave laws, state laws, employers' own handbooks and policy. And depending on what that employee's job is, whether or not that is a valid excuse or not, it sort of leaves the EEOC's jurisdiction at that point. But there's certainly a whole host of other local, state, and other federal laws that you would have to deal with before terminating an employee when they don't meet one of these exemptions.
Well, I want to, so our time is really approaching. We've run over a few minutes, but I do want to just have the panelists give us, a minute takeaway from this, that they would like to share with you before this program ends. So I'll start with Gail. Are you back with us? Uh-oh. No. You want to put some, you want to type something in the chat and I can read it? Okay, we'll move on. Okay. Bill, you'll do the California piece.
Yeah, so the one point that I think has guided our thinking and has been helpful along the way is to understand that these are uncertain times with uncertain outcomes, with people who are trying to navigate both their personal and familial health situations while at the same time doing their job. And as employers, what we're trying to do, and I encourage everybody to do, and it's kind of in response to the last question as well, is understand that these are sincerely held beliefs and concerns that people have. And thus far, our experience has been that with some effort, we have the ability to find workarounds during the pandemic, because as much as every day it feels like it's never going to end, eventually it will someday. Hopefully we'll be able to go back to whatever normal life is like. But I think having the empathy both for the employees and encouraging employees to have empathy for their coworkers as well, thinking in terms of a community solution to the problem is incredibly helpful.
Great. Carla?
Thanks. I would just say, that the issues facing employers are really tough right now, but I think they're going to get better, right? As the vaccine gets rolled out and is more available and there's more of a track record among the public recipients, of the vaccine, and that in people's eyes it becomes safer and less of an unknown, because right now it's the unknowns that are causing the problems for employers getting employees vaccinated in the workplace.
And Commissioner Sonderling.
Well, thank you for having me. And, the EEOC is committed to putting out additional guidance on this as issues arise. A lot of this now is still hypothetical because the vaccine is not widely distributed and it's still under emergency use authorization. So as it becomes more widely distributed and people start getting it and wanting to return to work or don't want to return to work, I think the EEOC has a duty to continue to update our guidance. So we would really value all of your input as our next rounds of guidance come out. Please reach out to us and let us know, how we can provide either industry-specific guidance or how we can continue to modify our guidance. And I just want to give one more plug to our guidance. You can find it at eeoc.gov/coronavirus. Today, we really focused on the vaccination part of it, but other categories of our virus guidance includes confidentiality of medical information, hiring and onboarding, pandemic-related harassment due to national origin, race, or other protected characteristics, furloughs and layoffs, return to work, age discrimination, and caregiver and family responsibilities. And we want to keep updating these categories, so we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I know as being members of the public, we do appreciate and appreciate the importance of EEOC engaging with the public, especially on these really very critical issues. And I just want to say thank you to all the panelists for their work on this, and we thank SafeHeart for sponsoring the CLE. And I just want to say that, and one of the things we have learned in the past year is that, the virus is here and we have to figure out how to live with it. And we've learned to pivot so much and throughout this past year, and we're going to continue to have to do that as things change. We have to, encourage that there's flexibility in education and communication in order for us to really, be personally safe and have our communities be safe. And to the extent that unions and employees have voices, we can work with employers to make certain that we all reach our common goals of safety and health for all our communities. So I want to say thank you again to the college, and don't forget your CLE forms. And again, the code is SS7881, and have a great day.